This is the Sustainable Goat Podcast.
We look to nature for how we should interrelate to the world. All the answers are within nature if we take the time to listen.
But what we have to find is a reasonable way how to handle plastic.
You know, consumers expect more. They're expecting brands to be more sustainable. They're choosing sustainable brands.
These are the stories and ideas from those that will define a generation. I'm your host, Steve Cassinem, and this is our planet in focus. Where did your interest in food kind of begin? Was it from a young age or was it a little bit older?
You know, it's funny because I'm not a farmer and I don't spend, I'm on the farm every single day. I work there and I go out there and it's a bit of my peaceful space. And I do a lot of education around the subject matter of food systems. But my background's actually in mostly environmental, wildlife, animal welfare issues. And I did that professionally for about 15 years in the nonprofit sector. But kind of jumping all over the place here, I did a permaculture design course when I was 18 years old. I was fortunate to have a cousin who helped start a permaculture farm in Costa Rica. That was really this experiential, unique agroturismo type of space. So I went down there as kind of a fresh high school graduate without any specific vision as to what direction my life was taking. And I took this course that it was really simply because it was an opportunity to go to Costa Rica. And I kind of banked all of that and put it aside and built my career for many years. And it wasn't until my nonprofit that was doing environmental education in schools, mostly focused on single-use plastics, merged with the Ecology Center in 2016, that a lot of that permacultural, background and principles that I've been really kind of sitting on for many, many years came back into the fold.
I think you have a lot of interest now in single-use plastic and just kind of that side of things, but you were doing this before it became, the buzzword and the popularity. Where did you first experience that? Because I think that's kind of the interesting thing that I always find is like, what's the journey to where you are now is those life experience that you did have. You went down to Costa Rica thinking, hey, I'm just going to go down after high school. But I also think there's value in that. Just going straight to, the job and the career, you probably got a different perspective when you were down there. So when was kind of your first experience with kind of seeing that, hey, the world needs a little bit of, like you saw it firsthand, and then world needs to kind of shift a little bit?
Yeah, well, there's a long and a short answer to that, as with everything. But, we're here, so I might as well share a little story. I grew up with immigrant parents, and I think that really formed a lot of my experience and expression in growing up in the United States. My parents didn't speak English when they came over here, so I always had a little bit of a different reality to my neighbors and my classmates, and I really credit a lot of the work and the passions and the opportunities that I've been afforded to that experience growing up. Kind of all of that just goes to say, my parents were always very mindful of conservation, not really necessarily from an environmental standpoint, but really more so just from a practicality standpoint. You reuse the plastic container that the butter comes in because why would you spend more money on another plastic container to put stuff in? So conservation was really something that was practiced, but not necessarily preached in my household growing up. But there was a lot of conversation and experience that was focused on compassion and empathy. And I'm kind of telling this broader story because I think it leads into, some of the focuses that I've been able to follow. I started at a very young age volunteering at a shelter for unhoused individuals in San Diego. At 12 years old, I showed up. I don't even remember why I ended up going, but I got a lot of value out of it. And I quickly noticed that the more I gave, the more I got. And to be completely selfish and honest, I really liked that feeling. So I went back every week and I was there and I was this little kind of mascot at this facility where everyone is usually retired that's helping out. And here's this little kid that just knows everybody's name and is having a great time. So that built this kind of sense of giving more than we take as community members that I've really tried to hold for the rest of my life. All of that goes to say a lot of that passion and compassion really started focusing on the environment when I was in high school. really thinking about what are we doing as humans, what's kind of happening on this planet, leading into college. Obviously, the permaculture design course helped. Thinking a lot about our surroundings and really more grassroots efforts. So, like in college, helping get a bike lane on campus. And that was a huge to-do at San Diego State University, which you'd think is kind of obvious for a college campus. But it was cool to be at a university that did not have this strong activist history. A lot of my friends right now, and especially in this work and in this world, come from the Berkeleys and the UC Santa Cruzes and the small liberal arts schools where it was inherent and expected that you would be this eco warrior and this activist and this kind of all-knowing thing. And I actually came from like a totally different educational background where the school was focused on what it was doing. And it really wasn't that much of a progressive hub, especially, in the year 2000. So, just having these hard-fought battles for small things, figuring out why we can't get rid of single-use plastic bottles because the bookstore who happens to be the purchaser for all of the different outlets has this contract with Cisco, and it's written into the contract that they need to buy X amount of single-use plastic bottles and they have to be on the shelves. So all that sort of stuff, just goes to say, kind of raised the collective both frustration, but also fire for doing this work and then taking it throughout the career, and I'm happy to talk about that. But for me, one of the things that always stood out, whether I was working in international wildlife conservation or waterways or the environment, was the simple individual actions that any single one person could take to make a difference, right? Like as a pragmatist, I'm always a little frustrated by the speed or the lack of speed at which our top-down systems work. Waiting for policy changes and even waiting for big business to make change is boring to me, and it's critical. And I really appreciate the people that have the stamina to work in that space and spend 20 years working on a piece of legislation. But that's not me. So from a very young age, I was always mobilizing people around like, hey, what if you composted at home? What if we, ate a little bit less meat, right? What if and one of the things that I got really passionate about was eliminating single-use plastics, especially in the capacity in which we all very easily can. We know that microplastics and plastics are what we see in the consumer kind of life is the tip of the iceberg. There's more underwater than there is above, both literally and figuratively. But there are so many things that we can do individually to just make a little bit of a difference. And the one that like really struck me at a pretty young age, and it's not going to solve all of our problems, but it certainly was a little bit of kind of this thing that we can look up to, was the single-use plastic straw, which was like, here's this thing that is 100% avoidable. Certain things are going to take a little bit of infrastructure and implementation to see change on, but straws are just like, don't ask for it. And like, yeah, there are a certain percentage of people on this planet that might have certain disabilities that might require it. And in that case, we can use alternatives, or even if you could reduce by 99.8%, like I've always said that perfection is not that interesting, right? It's really more about progress and intention. But the funny thing is that when you go out into the world, and I gained a little bit of visibility and recognition and did a TED Talk, and it was speaking at the world's largest corporate sustainability conference about stuff like this, people always come back at you with like, well, what about syringes in hospitals? Are you saying we should reuse those? It's like, well, yeah, but that's not what we're talking about, right? Like just because the hardest possible thing is going to be challenging doesn't mean that we shouldn't address the easiest thing. So kind of, jumping all over the place here, but the idea was like, it always made sense in my mind that we can all do something to make our communities cleaner, greener, healthier, and more vibrant. And that's really what we've been working on for, nearly 20 years.
Yeah. Well, and I love that you hit on the idea of progress, not perfection. That's actually something that we've been focusing on a lot at GOAT, is this idea of having a perfectly sustainable world is a big goal. And many will say it's completely unattainable. And I kind of believe to a certain extent it can't be attainable. However, that doesn't mean that the progress isn't incredibly important. And I think that the more people think of that progress of being an everyday, if you shoot for the moon and you end up just very short of it, you still made a ton of progress along the way, and that makes a lot of impact. And I think a lot of people forget that their small actions that they do day to day can actually make a bigger difference because you're collectively doing it as a community. And so, I mean, one of the things that we lead at GOAT is this idea of community, circularity, and intention. Like if you root everything in those three things, you're going to make progress towards a more sustainable world. And that's kind of where we kind of find a lot of our conversations landing, is that every single person that we talk with generally has an intention around it. They're trying to build community around this idea, and they have this thought process of circularity. I mean, even going back to the idea of a butter container, like, it's how do you just close the loop a little bit more? Because it's not actually that difficult of a task to do. It's just nobody knows. And I think that's one of the most interesting things. And food systems, to me, I think is one of the most complicated areas of sustainability, because it's often very misunderstood, but it is a very complicated industry. I mean, from big food to small food to local food to community gardens. I mean, there's a whole system here. To you, what is the ideal food system?
That's a great question. A lot of times in this field, we talk about these aspirations and this kind of the futurism around what would be the ideal expression. And I think that it bears kind of jumping into the humility of saying, like, maybe let's look backwards sometimes instead of forward. For all of human history, people lived in relationship to the planet, to one another, and to their food. It was a survival necessity. And, about 75 years ago, we decided to industrialize our food system and replace humans and animals with machines and chemicals. And as we know here, preaching to the choir, but that had terrible effects for our environment, our health, our wildlife, and our waterways. And it really kind of ecologically, one of the worst decisions we've ever made as a humankind. But really, like, I think back at how everyone's grandparents or great-grandparents lived. You can go back 80 years or 800 years, and food really didn't change very much in that period. And of course, like, we have had these great technological and industrial advances that have helped in certain ways, but I think they've really hurt a whole lot more. So to answer your question, an ideal food system revolves around relationship, which is, where is my food coming from? Who's growing it? How is it being grown? And why does that matter? And for everyone, that looks a little bit different. If you live in New York City or Mumbai or Southern California, it's not going to have the same answer. And I actually think that that's where the beauty lies. The more that we try to homogenize this planet and say everybody has to live the same way, that's where we start to see the costs of, oh, well, great. Now people around the world want blue jeans and televisions and double cheeseburgers. That's actually not sustainability. It's independence versus interdependence. So I like to think about, to give you a short answer, there's a few simple things that near everyone can do, especially in the Western world, which is grow your own. That's not a reality for 50 or 80 or 30% of people, but it is, I think, an energetic expression that has value, even if it's not focused on the production, right? Like, throw some green onion in your windowsill and regrow it, right? Like, I think just the simple practice of experiencing the life cycle and the growth of food makes you value it a little bit more. So whether or not you have 1 acre or 5,000 square feet or 50 square feet, there's, I think, some relationship that we can all have to growing food. And I think that it's important more for its energetic value than its practical value. And then really it's starting to learn about your local agricultural network, which is not that hard to access in the United States. If you live in an urban environment in 2023, there's likely 1 or 10 or 50 farmers markets per week within a 10-mile radius of you. So that just means, taking your Sunday morning and maybe watching a little bit less football and maybe getting outside and then meeting people and saying, hey, where's your farm? Wow, it's 50 miles away. It's 5 miles away. I didn't know there were farms 5 miles away from here. What do you guys grow? Why do you grow that? Whoa, cool. How did you guys end up on that land? Was that your families? I think just a simple conversation like that, which can be had by anyone who doesn't need to know anything about agriculture, is going to start to educate oneself as to why you might want to support locally, because you want to stimulate your economy, because you care about protecting open space in your community for whatever reason. And then, obviously starting to, as we do look at some of these top-down systems, which has to be, unfortunately, part of the solution, is starting to reform the ways in which our communities are designed and our infrastructure and even our federal government plays a part in this conversation, which is we as an organization, the Ecology Center, are helping create vibrant agricultural systems on underutilized plots of land. So the school that has that extra softball field or the ancillary parking lot, or the housing development that realized they don't need 7 swimming pools in the whole community. They might need 5, or the city that owns this piece of land that maybe someday is slated to become something, maybe not. All of these spaces can really begin to be pretty vibrant, and they don't need to be 5,000 acres. It's actually quite better that they're not. Under 5 would be ideal. And that's where I like to see us go backwards, which is that, again, for all of human history, we all lived within a stone's throw of some sort of agricultural production because it was needed. So how do we bring that back into our communities?
Yeah, what was that turning point or that catalyst? Because I mean, you look at back, 70 years, World War II, it was, you grew a garden, a victory garden, to actually support people who were overseas fighting the war and, support your own community. That shift to industrialization, what was that catalyst that suddenly it was like, well, yeah, let's mass produce food and let's do all these things and let's turn this into a massive system? Was it to alleviate, that stress of food? Or was it actually just the opportunity of technology to enable transportation of food?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is that it's a bit of everything. We had a boom of cheap and readily available chemical and synthetics coming out of post-war era because we were using them to kill people. And we realized that can be used in agricultural functions. So that's
which is already a bit backwards, but
yeah, it's not a good start. And then really, coming out of the war and out of the Great Depression and into a new economic reality and industrialization at the same time, and this kind of elevation of all of our lives and wanting to live more convenient and comfortable existences led to this kind of the loss and maybe a huge amount of post-war immigration. Also, we know as we move geographically, we start to lose some of the intergenerational cultural values that our families had. So it could have just been that all of those things happened at the same time. And I'm not the expert here, but essentially, call it from 1950 to 1990 or 2000, we said like, all right, food is just a commodity, right? It's just calories. They just exist to keep us alive. And if it's delicious and fatty or salty or sugary, even better. That being said, we always kept in the back of our brain this very important cultural nugget of the role that food plays in our lives. If you think about all of our celebrations, weddings, holidays, funerals, birthdays, they all revolve around food. But we kept the skeleton of like, all right, we're going to gather around food, but we lost all of the values, which was, oh, right, grandma used to sit with her mom around the table in Italy and shell fava beans for 3 hours because it takes a while to do that work, right? And that's part of the silent meditation of the food, the preparation, right? It wasn't about going to Costco and buying the rotisserie chicken. So, to answer your question, I don't know how and why we lost the culture in agriculture, but I think that the good part is that, in today and age, like people want it back. We are seeing that there's a strong movement and driver towards the craft and the DIY. And a lot of it's in the food systems. And a lot of it was happening before the pandemic, with people making their own sourdough bread starts and brewing beer at home or getting chickens for their backyards. I've seen it in my community for 15, 20 years. And it just got kind of kicked into high gear when we all stayed home for a year or two. But I think not just the younger generations, but anecdotally, the permaculture design courses that I've been involved in now leading in the past 15 years, it seems like everyone is under 30 or over 60. So there are 2 very specific groups of people right now, but they're big blocks that do want to be outside. They do want to work with their hands. They do want to value quality. And a lot of it is represented in their purchasing power and in their in-home and behavior decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that, I go back to even in my childhood was I had this, I was lucky enough to grow up in Santa Cruz. And so you had that mindset of almost UCSC and everything in the community. But I remember there was this backfield behind my house, and my neighbor who lived back there, he grew a bunch of food in the garden, always did. And whenever they went on vacation, my responsibility as like an 8-year-old was to go water their garden. When you're 8, you're kind of like, oh, just water, and can I get done with this so I can go play or something like that. But what I distinctly remember was he would come over with this bowl, and it would be tomatoes, raspberries, whatever it was. And I just remember the flavor of that being, you couldn't find that in a store. Like there was something about that homegrown tomato or that homegrown raspberry that just, you couldn't match it. And so for me, it was always that I feel like people don't have that opportunity to experience the actual elevated nature of having truly quality food that's grown mindfully, cleanly, and regeneratively. And I think once you have that experience, it's hard to go back because you're desiring almost that best tomato, so to speak. Where did kind of regenerative agriculture start to enter the picture? Because I mean, I've been living in Boulder after recently moving, and we were having discussions when regenerative ag became more of a bigger discussion when the Rodale Institute came out kind of with it and everything. And there's this discussion about the confusion that the consumer essentially would have because they're still trying to understand organic, and that organic's not necessarily organic, and how all of that works together. Where do you find that regenerative piece landing? Because Ecology Center is definitely at the middle of that. And what does that mean for like soil and the ability to provide more food?
Yeah, so I think to understand that you have to go back in history a little bit and kind of understand that when we did begin to introduce chemicals, fertilizers, and ultimately poisons into our food system, there was a fairly strong pushback to it right away because everyone at that time knew what it looked like 15 or 50 years before. It was small, but it was concentrated and directed. And, for 50, 60 years, that organic food movement, either with a name or not, was gaining traction and visibility and recognition. And for many years, nobody cared. And then we now, from probably the early 2000s to 2020, began to see this adoption. Obviously, Whole Foods being the more commercial expression of it, farmers markets being the much more authentic version of it. We all began to see more options on our menus and in our stores and in our neighborhoods. So as you said, like that began to gain a little bit of commercial visibility and adoption. It's still obviously not the primary offering an option, right? I don't know what percentage of food in our stores or at our restaurants is organic, but I would guess it's not over 30. That being said, I don't know if it was 10 years ago or 20, but certainly it's not a new idea. A group of people came together and said, the organic food movement, especially as it applies as a certification and as a standard, is not the ceiling. It's not the absolute best we can do. Actually, it's probably the very least we should do, right? Like we can all agree here. If I were to walk around and poll 100 random people and say, hey, Steve, do you think it's a good idea to spray poison on our food? I think you'd say no. And then if I went to the next person, Pam, Mary, Jim, Bob, is it a good idea to spray poison on your food? Probably not. Yeah, I think we all can agree on that. And, especially when a lot of those poisons are the same poisons we've used in the Vietnam War, like we use these things to kill people and then we brought them back home and we spray them on our food and then we feed them to our children. Most people can agree that's not a good idea. But that organic certification and standard alone was not addressing all of the environmental and social issues that our agricultural system provides. And we know that there's a lot of them. Agriculture is one of the single, if not the single largest contributors to climate emissions, right? It is a huge problem, water and wildlife and our own personal health as well. So a group of people came together and said, hey, what if we learn from the past? Again, none of these ideas are new. And I always like to start with that conversation that these are not new ideas developed by white people. They're actually old ideas developed by brown people. And as much as we can go back to some of those values and traditions and philosophies, the more we can begin to rebuild health. So the regenerative organic movement is just a name that a lot of those indigenous and ancient practices really upheld. I like to think about the like Southern Mexican milpa model, corn, bean, and squash. That's every farmer in Oaxaca in their backyard is going to be growing corn, bean, and squash. They call their farm their milpa. And what is that? The corn creates a stalk for our beans to climb up, and the squash creates ground cover because we don't have a lot of water down there. And that's a thousands-year-old system of permaculture, right? Well before we ever put a name on it. So this regenerative organic movement and then ultimately certification came together to coalesce around what could be this next gold standard. We have organic, it's starting to gain some visibility, but we know there's a lot of problems with organic. Right now, we're entered, and it's not new, probably in the last 25 years, into this age of industrialized organic. And Michael Pollan talks about it, which is that what does it mean to be, organic, but growing in mega acre monocrop operations in the Central Valley or in Central America. And it's still packaged in plastic and shipped around the world and grown by people that can't afford to buy the food that they're growing. That's not better per se. It's just not poisonous. So the regenerative organic movement, again, was this kind of aspiration to a new gold standard. And it came together through a group of nonprofits and for-profits and coalitions and farmers and academics, and created a nonprofit called the Regenerative Organic Alliance that was in large part funded by Dr. Bronner's and Patagonia and the Rodale Institute, big players in this ideology. And essentially, it coalesced around a value system that consisted of 4 pillars. One, that it be organic. Obviously, in order to be regenerative organic, you have to be organic. That's taking the poisons out of our food. It's a good start. 2, soil conservation. So you have to practice some methodology of soil health. We know now, and we're seeing these very important studies in the medical field and in Western science about the importance and value of health, not just from an environmental standpoint of carbon sequestration, but from a health standpoint. In order to have healthy food, you need to have healthy soil. So we have to practice a set specific guidelines on soil on our farm. 3 is animal welfare. This is something that's not addressed at all in organic. So you can go buy organic eggs or beef at the store. And what that means is that those animals don't have antibiotics or pesticides or hormones or, whatever various different things go into the actual food chain, but it speaks nothing of the welfare and treatment of those animals. So the $15 dozen organic eggs at the grocery store can still very well be grown or produced by a facility that has 5 million chickens in a football field size pen. It's a nightmare. It's an ecological nightmare, and it's certainly not fun for the chickens. So we have to meet a set of standards for animal welfare. And then 4th is farm worker rights. And that's, again, not addressed in the organic standards. So to be regenerative organic, you need to give your farm workers a living wage and health benefits and ideally full-time work so that they don't need to move around between various different agricultural communities doing migrant farming. And these standards, sometimes we'll talk about them and people say, wow, good job. And to me, it's like, well, that's basic human rights. We're talking about healthcare and the living wage. Unfortunately, 99.9% of farmers in this country and 99.99999% of farmers in the world don't meet those standards, right? Like we, as I mentioned earlier, are buying premium, quote unquote, organic food at luxury stores that are grown by people that can't afford to buy that food. And to us as an organization, we look around and we take stock of a society in which people are raising their collective consciousness and we're choosing specifically what car we buy and what clothes we buy because it aligns to our values and the reusable bottle. And nobody's really quite thinking about like, oh, right, does it matter that there be a fair wage and a living wage standard for farm workers? And now there's, to kind of wrap it all up, this certification that brings all 4 of those elements into one.
Well, and that was actually one thing that I've kind of thought about a lot is in that process. So let's say, because equitable access to food is, basic human right. It's like that should be what it is. And then when you start to look at it from an economic side, it's like, okay, if you're going to give everybody a living wage, well, then the price of the food's going to go up and you're just going to end up continue to chase the tail.
Yep.
How do you fix that loop? Because obviously I think, again, if you were asked Jim, Pam, and be like, hey, do you think the farmer who grew your food should be able to eat that food too? Of course they'd say yes.
Yeah.
Like they wouldn't be like, oh no, they should just have, whatever's left over. Like that's humans, I don't think would want that for another human. But there's this whole system that it's got to fit into. So where do you think that can actually kind of shift? Because I hear you on that, but then I also see the other side of like, well, yeah, but then naturally the business is going to be like, well, now that we incurred more cost, we have to keep our profit margin, keep the shareholder happy. So we're going to increase the cost of food, and that's going to get pushed to the consumer. The consumer's not going to buy organic. They're going to go back to the generic, and then it's just not going to actually help the problem.
Yeah, I love that question. And it's a conversation I really enjoy having. And as with everything in a complex system, there is no one answer. But there's a few things that come to mind to me that I think are very relevant and that everyone should really have some level of understanding on. First and most important, we pay less in relation to our individual wealth for food right now in 2023 than we ever have in all of human history. If you were to look back at what the cost of production and the labor and the seed and the distribution of food was in all of human history, it was a much higher proportion of our individual wealth. So we have brought the cost of food way, way, way down. And we have brought it down to an unsustainable standard that is now being floated because of social norms where we say, well, milk should be between $5 and $6. That's it. Why should it be that much? Because that's what my parents paid. Why should it be that much? Because that's what it costs at the store. But there's no level of relationship to the reality of what the actual or the true cost of milk or lettuce or anything, textiles, truly, truly is. So for starters, there does need to be a reintroduction as to the true cost of agricultural products. And does it need to be more than what we're paying now? Yes. And I tell people there's two different conversations here, which is the people that don't want to pay more and the people that can't pay more. So, let's have those both conversations. The people that don't want to pay more, that's really just a now kind of reframing of priorities and values and resources. There are people that live in $10 million homes by our farm that say, hey, your strawberries are $8 a pound. And at the store, they're $7, and it's like, okay, cool. Like, let's talk about that. I see that as an opportunity. It doesn't make me upset at all. But do I know that person can afford $8 strawberries? Like, yeah. So like, cool. Now, if I explain to them why, local, sustainable, seasonal, fresh, regenerative, farm worker supporting strawberries cost $1 more, 9 times out of 10, that person says, okay, that's cool. And by the way, they're 100 times better. Right? So
that taste, that top level tomato kind of feeling. Yeah,
exactly. So that's one issue. And we can kind of focus on that. And it's a big one, because a lot of people in our communities do have the means to make choices. And most people, if you're in the middle class, the lower middle class, the upper middle class, like you are pinched. We all are constrained by the decisions that we have made and the lifestyle that we can afford. But we also can be very real with one another and say like, yeah, the average American also has, probably 3 TVs in their home, right? Or 15 more pairs of shoes than they really use or whatever it might be. So again, it's just a question of prioritization. And I know that that's hard because behavior change is hard. And this is now like 50 years of this ingrained milk is $5 because that's what it is. Now, the other conversation is about those who can't afford to buy the food. That's about access and equity. And that's a very important conversation and a even much more complicated one. The few things that I can bring up that speak to that is, unfortunately, it comes down kind of from the federal and the state level. The amount of resources that go into agriculture in this country are astounding. The Farm Bill represents billions and billions of dollars that are put into growing corn and soy that are never going to be used for human consumption, right? So we're growing soy to feed cows and corn to produce ethanol to drive cars. And we're essentially paying farmers to do that. We're subsidizing that. And that, to me, is a failure of imagination of what our agricultural systems could run on if we put some of that resource into actually nourishing people, right? I like to talk about the fact, there's food insecurity is a real thing, but there's not a food shortage on this problem, food shortage problem on this planet. There's a problem of creative distribution, what we grow, where we grow it, and what it's going into. So, if we just transformed if we were to cut down meat consumption and grow less soy and use that agricultural production to grow more food and subsidize it, like surely we can get more nutritious local food into people's hands and mouths. So, I don't claim to have all of the answers, but there certainly are simple steps that could be taken to start to see a little bit more adoption of the prioritization and the distribution of real food.
Well, and I think the psychology and lifestyle change, I think to me, that's the biggest hurdle, because that does influence a lot of the infrastructure change and everything that kind of goes with it. Because I think that people forget that most of the time you're going to eat more than you might necessarily turn on the TV in a day. And so when you start to look at the things that you actually need to survive and to actually grow and stay healthy and do the things that you love, food is the fuel for that. And I think that priority hasn't been really up there. I mean, as you mentioned, it's more of just that it's to keep us going. It's not necessarily to help us even more. And so when I start to look at what that change can look like on a global scale, I also think a lot of it comes down to the choices that we're willing to be comfortable with. Are we willing to just not maybe buy the 4th yoga mat or the 5th thing of juice that day? What can we do in our own home? Do you think that the willingness for people to change is more the crux than the ability for the system to change?
It has to be both, at the end of the day. And what you just kind of mentioned got me thinking a little bit, going back to the last question, about being a little bit more forward thinking as a society as well, right? Like the amount of resources that go into our I don't call it healthcare, I call it sick care system, right? And what we could preventatively avoid by doing simple things like changing diet, right? So it's about reallocation. The amount that it costs us to keep a very unhealthy country alive is astounding. Could we put some of that resourcing into just feeding people better food? Of course.
What I find really funny about that process, though, is thinking about, you watch like a professional sports game, right? And whatever sport that is, and you're like, man, that top level athlete, the Steph Curry, the whatever. Well, guess what? They're probably eating the best available food because they need it for the performance. And yet cut to commercial, and you're like, I want to perform at that level. And then you cut to commercial. It's like, buy these Frito-Lays. And it's like, there's an inherent, I guess, contradiction in that process that I feel like if we all, tried to perform at that level and genuinely took it seriously, I think you could also find that behavior change, because then the focus then becomes, how do I fuel myself with the best thing possible?
Totally. Yeah. You like, there's this new, I guess maybe not that new, but like ultra marathoners, MMA fighters, Tom Brady, like these ultra elite athletes, they're like mostly plant-based, eating at home 5 meals a day with like all organic ingredients. It's not a coincidence that, we're seeing these athletes be able to perform peak at age 42, right? But yeah, no, it's just a function of priorities. And it's something that, to get kind of back to your question right now, which is like, how do we as people prioritize some of this stuff? I think naturally it's starting to happen a little bit. I mean, obviously there's a booming health food world, and that's both as much part of the solution as it can be part of the problem. There's a tremendous amount of greenwashing in this space. A big problem that we have in the United States that they don't in Europe is labeling. We have all sorts of crazy labels here. You can make the most insane claims on your packaging you want, from the simple stuff like healthy, nutritious, right, to like fights cancer, like all of these things that you start to see on packages that you're like, what, this is, well, I don't even know what's in this, it's a problem that sometimes when there is energy and enthusiasm for systems and behavior change, that the market sometimes capitalizes and takes advantage of that. So the most we can do, and it's why we exist as an organization, is to educate people as to the best possible decisions, which is, all right, like at the end of the day, pretty much anything in the center aisles of the grocery store are not very good for you. So try to avoid them. If you can avoid the grocery store altogether, even better. I like to be realistic as to the reality. Like, it's true that most of us either don't have the time or skills or energy to start making our own jams and pickles and miso. Like, that's probably true. We're not going to go back to an agrarian society to a certain extent. So, and it gets just back to the conversation about perfection. Like, Do we need to be perfect? Probably not. Do we need to be a whole lot better? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Well, and tell me a bit about the progress that the Ecology Center has had, because that piece of land has actually a storied history too. So tell me a little bit about Ecology Center and kind of the founding of it, how it came about, and kind of where you guys are at today.
Yeah, we're fortunate to steward a very special parcel of land in South Orange County in a city called San Juan Capistrano. We have this historic farmhouse that was built in the 1870s and farmed forever since. That family that built the home sold it to a Japanese family in the 1900s who held it for multiple generations and farmed and farmsteaded and homesteaded, which really means they grew their own food, they nourished themselves, and then they sold or traded or whatever they could, anything else. Ultimately, what happened is a good demonstration of a lot of the transformation that we've been seeing with our agricultural spaces in the past 50 years, which is that, a child or a grandchild inherits a piece of land and they've got two decisions. One, they can keep doing this pretty hard work that isn't particularly glamorous and certainly wasn't in the 70s and 80s and 90s and kind of these decades in which commodification and capitalization were some of the priorities in our society. Or two, they can sell their valuable suburban Southern California real estate for $25 million. And I don't blame anyone for making that decision. It's a pretty simple decision, but the problem is that we have lost, especially we live in Orange County, right? It's like, it was orange groves. We live in a county and community in which, one, we have incredibly fertile, amazing farmland, and two, all of it is gone. All of it, right? Like the one thing that Orange County is known for is either commercial or residential real estate. I like to call it the capital of cul-de-sacs and consumerism. So the land was sold in the early 90s. And fortunately for us, the buyer was the city of San Juan Capistrano. They kind of stepped up and they said, hey, we've lost all of our farms in this small town, and here's the last one. And if we don't buy this land, we run the risk of losing our cultural value of agriculture. So they bought the land in 1990, and they leased it to a farmer who he and his wife were organic growers and doing great work. And they farmed that land for over 25 years. And they farmed it in the way in which they knew how, which was this kind of the commercial organic methodology of growing a few things and selling them wherever you could, mostly wholesale. It happened to be, and kind of now mixing histories, the city bought this land, they leased out the 28-acre farm, but they kept the farmhouse and the 1 acre around it as a separate parcel. And they did nothing with it. It was a dirt lot in this historic home. They had a vision of one day maybe building a museum about San Juan or who knows what, but it's a small town and they never got their act together. Our founder and kind of my partner in this work, Evan, he came across this historic farm home in 2008, and he had been teaching permaculture design in Central America and creating eco farms in West Africa. And he had this vision, which was that, as much as it's important and meaningful to do agroecology in the developing world, all of these countries have a much deeper relationship to food than we do in the wealthiest country on the planet. So he came home to Orange County, came across this property and said, let's build an ecology center. And it was a humble nonprofit expression of education and engagement and experiences. So for 10 years, 2008 to 2018 or so, it was a space for field trips and festivals and workshops and farm dinners, movie nights and speaker series, really a lighthouse for this movement of ultimately permaculture without using the word permaculture, right? Given that we're in Orange County, that it's not the most progressive community in the world, we wanted to drive people to this work and this movement through its beauty and diversity and flavor instead of through its value system per se. There's a lot of people that wouldn't go out of their way to sign up for a worm bin building workshop, but would love to be in a beautiful garden. So a lot of that work was just around transforming the space and using it to create meaningful activations that just showed people a more beautiful and delicious afternoon. Long story long, in 2019, that farm that surrounded us went out of business. That wholesale model was no longer viable. And the city, who were our landlord and their landlord, essentially came to us and said, would you like to take over the farm? And we said, yeah, absolutely. cut to city council meetings and RFP processes, taking over the farm in 2019, completely redesigning it, planting 1,200 fruit trees, reorienting the farm to more effectively utilize our resources, sun and water, and gaining some traction. And then March of 2020, I don't know if you turned on the news, but things changed quite a bit. And our community, for better, began to ask, like, where's the food? It's not at the grocery store. And began to make the subtle realization, either consciously or subconsciously, that when we're relying on a food system in which we have a grower and then a broker and then a distribution company and then a shipping and then a warehouse and then a wholesaler and then a reseller, one of those links in the chain breaks down and all of a sudden the grocery stores have no food, even though the farms are still growing it. So, for us, it was an opportunity to open people's eyes as to the importance and value of having agriculture back in our communities. I like to talk about it like an insurance policy. A farm is nice to have when things are good, and it's critical when times are bad. So for us, the last 4 years have represented a reality in which people are turned on to the importance and benefit and value of protecting local agriculture. And we get to use our 28-acre farm to be a thought leader and a inspirational space and a mobilizer and an organizer in whatever possible way we can, either educational programming or experiences or dinners or whatever, to raise that collective consciousness and remind people, hey, this work is beautiful and delicious and important, right? To summarize it all, I've spent too many years being against stuff, being against single-use plastic straws or whatever it might be. And I've found now that it's a little bit easier and a little bit more fun to be for something, which is like, hey, here's the best meal you've ever had. Wouldn't it be interesting to try to replicate that at home more often? Right? Here's a space that is surrounded by beautiful birds and insects and is alive, right? And has medicinals and edibles and all sorts of drought tolerant and native plants. Isn't that a little bit more interesting than the Southern California sterile, poisonous grass lawn? So there are things that we can do as an organization now that just help people realize and understand, like, I get it. I understand it's happening.
Yeah, I think there's a certain level of positivity that needs to be rooted in a lot of this discussion and movement and everything like that. I mean, I think that's what we try to stand on at GOAT, is this idea of it can be a positive thing. It doesn't need to be, oh, the world's ending, we need to do this. It's instead, let's join in and somebody's actually doing something meaningful and awesome, and it's cool to talk about, and it's fun, and it's an interesting discovery, and it's a learning experience. Make it more interactive. I think people want to be more curious. I think the curiosity, I think, thankfully, is coming back a little bit, and there needs to be outlets to explore that curiosity. And when we can provide those positive interactions, it gives people that opportunity to maybe make those behavioral changes, because then it just seems a little bit easier. You're not necessarily going upstream. You're just going to go with the flow of the water. When it comes to regenerative farming, what does that actually mean? So, I mean, it does get thrown around. Some people understand it, other people don't. For Ecology Center, but also the bigger picture, what does regenerative organic actually mean?
Yeah, it's, in talking about greenwashing, I was at the Natural Products Expo. It's called Expo West. It's the big,
huge. The
funny thing is there's nothing natural about it, right? It's like, it's indoors and it's packaged plastic junk food. And there's organic ingredients, or there's coconut powder or crickets or whatever interesting, trendy thing is happening right now. So it's not that, to me. That can be a part of the solution. And full and fair credit, there are brands right now that are doing their very best to implement these practices in a scalable fashion. I have my own personal opinions as to whether or not you can scale sustainability. Globally, probably not. Nationally, maybe. But I definitely appreciate and applaud those who are trying to commercialize real and meaningful solutions that have ecological principles at them. I had the chance to meet the family, 3 generations of Lundbergs from the rice company, and they get it. They totally get it. They have certified a certain percentage of their product in ROC, regenerative organic. They have a lot of purchasing power. They're in nearly every store in the country.
And outstanding rice, by the way. Fantastic product.
Rice and good people. And I really enjoyed the conversation that I had with them and think that that's a part of the solution. And great. We all have pantries. We all need to stock them. Buy Lundberg rice. I don't get paid by Lundberg, but go ahead and give them a little
second
bit of
that.
Yeah. And we do, like I said, we're not going to grow all of our own food, and we're not going to certainly preserve or ferment all of our own food and fill our pantries and fill our fridges. But I do believe that more than not, of the solution needs to be rooted in this local relationship to farms and farmers. I think that going out and meeting, like I said, at your farmer's market, whoever your local one, or in your case, there's probably dozens of farms, and asking them about their practices. And they may not be regenerative organic certified. One, because maybe they've never heard of it, or two, because maybe they haven't yet reached certain amount of the standards that it takes to gain that certification, or three, in large parts, I find that it's mostly intimidation and probably also a little bit of capacity and bandwidth, right? Like farmers have very hard jobs. They're farming. You can't take days off on a farm, and then you're expected to go work the farmer's market, and that's on your day off. And you might be driving 2 hours to make $600 at the market. It's really hard. So when you tell that person, hey, try to implement this new system that requires a little bit more administration and is going to cost you more, and I promise that you're going to make it up on the back end with profits, that's a hard step to take for a lot of people, especially when most farms in this country are over leveraged and they've been sold this kind of false bill of like, yeah, buy the extra John Deere tractor and buy all this stuff that you don't need. And I promise you're going to make it back. And we've got 0% interest rates, and don't worry about it.
I think that's you hit on something I think really important. I think that a lot of the perception of farmers is specifically the ones that grow the generic, non-organic, none of that they love that business and they want to do that, but really they've just been cornered because their land is getting hurt, and that is their source of revenue. It's their way of growing. I think it's a really hard system sometimes to fit in, and even going to like a regenerative organic or an organic certification, it does cost money. It does take time. I remember I worked in coffee probably about 5-6 years ago, and when you go deep on the coffee sourcing process, a lot of the farms that may be grown organic and everything is organic, they're just not certified organic because they can't afford it. And it doesn't mean that they're not still doing the right thing. And I think that part is such an important part, is asking why and how. And I don't think enough people do that.
Yeah. And I think in this, it is very important to acknowledge and recognize how hard it is to farm and to make a living off of farming. So, any narrative that involves blaming the farmers with whatever practice, conventional or not, I don't endorse, right? I think that almost every single one of these people are doing the absolute best that they can, that they know how, or that they can afford. And I think it's really just an opportunity now of this kind of shared need to raise those individuals up. And that can be through infrastructure pieces like the Farm Bill, or it can be through grassroots pieces like the Regenerative Organic Alliance and educational offerings, or it can be through like cool and interesting public-private partnerships like Kashi the cereal company supporting transitional organic, right? Like they have a very strong focus on saying like, yeah, we can probably afford to buy all organic ingredients, but we're actually going to go out of our way to support farms that are moving towards organic so that we can create more organic farmland. That's cool. Like, I like that. So there's, I think, a lot of ways to support that farmer. And I think it's going to take all of them in order to get there. We as an organization, the Ecology Center, on a pretty small footprint, 28 acres in Southern California, have a pretty simple and humble goal of just simply nourishing our community. So, that helped us create a set of boundaries that have kept us on track in a certain and meaningful way. One of them was that we weren't going to do wholesale. Like, you simply can't afford to pay your farmers a living wage and honor soil and respect animals and farm in an ecological fashion and then sell for pennies on the dollar, right? So we kind of took a flyer and said, hey, what if we did the absolute best that we can and grew the most interesting and diverse and delicious ingredients? And don't we think people are going to show up and pay for them and hopefully pay a premium, what the true cost is? And that's been by and large true. So, having a little bit of a vision and ambition and risk-taking capacity and ability can maybe kind of lead in the right direction. Like I think about the farm stand that we took over. There was a farm stand on that property, and it was an organic farm stand. But they mostly grew food on the farm and sold it wholesale, and then they would buy wholesale to sell retail, which from a business standpoint doesn't make a ton of sense to me. But that was because in the 90s, they had a belief that, if people were going to pay a premium and buy organic and go out of their way to go to a smaller store that's not a one-stop shop, they're going to want to have strawberries year round. They're going to want to have mangoes and bananas and things that don't grow in Southern California. When we took over that farm stand, we said, hey, this might upset one or two people, but we're sorry, we're not going to sell bananas here because we don't grow bananas, right? We're not going to sell mangoes here because we don't grow mangoes. We're not going to sell strawberries in October because they don't grow in October. And, by and large, our community was tremendously enthusiastic about the shift of having somebody help educate and engage them as to the importance and value and benefit of some of those decisions, right? The business didn't go down, it doubled and tripled. And that was because people began to see, these tastemakers can actually have a strong point of view and share with us why and how some of these ingredients are grown and when they're grown and varieties and diversity and that sort of thing. So not to say that it's easy, but it's doable.
Can you hit on some of the seasonality of food? I think the perception is that, food should be available 24/7 and it's the same foods. You just go to the store and that's your shopping list. Like, what's this idea of seasonality that food actually grows at different times? Because I don't think a lot of people actually think about that.
Yeah, I think in like outlining the three single greatest priorities in food making decisions, seasonality is one of them, right? So I think like keeping poison out of our food, so call it organic, call it regenerative organic, whatever it might be. That's one. I think how animals and farm workers are treated has to be another one. And then the seasonality is really the third. And that's something that, again, is not new, right? If you were to go back to the old country and talk to anyone over 80 years old, they can tell you exactly what season we're in and what is most delicious right now. And they usually can do that because they walk to the market every day and they meet the farmer and they look at every individual piece of whatever it might be and say, this is the one I want for dinner tonight. And then guess what? Those people happen to be the healthiest in the world. So to me, that piece on seasonality, we can tell the story and kind of get people excited about it through a few different narratives, whichever one might be most interesting to you. One, and the simple one, is flavor, right? Food in season is more delicious, right? Food that hasn't traveled 2,000 miles is more delicious. Food that's not packaged in plastic is more delicious. So that's a pretty easy one. Two is nutrition, right? Again, if we're growing in the right season, if we're respecting our soils, our food is going to be more nutrient dense. And I think the more we can kind of bang that drum and build, instead of thinking of it from a scarcity mentality, like, shoot, like I don't get my October strawberries. I really wanted them and I'd love to put them on this cake. It's more of a mentality on like the enthusiasm and the opportunity to get very excited about strawberries starting in February or March, and you saying like, I haven't had a strawberry this year. I'm so excited because that first one I have is going to be amazing. And I live under the belief that there's more opportunity when we have constraint than there is when everything for everyone all of the time is an option. So I like to get excited. I had the first cucumber of the year a week ago, and it was one of the best moments of my day, Whereas when it's just as simple as going on Amazon and saying, hey, send me cucumbers to my door, I don't think we value or appreciate them very much.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that think about those times where, I don't know, for some people it's, summer barbecuing. Barbecued vegetables on the grill is fantastic. And, in some places it doesn't get warm enough for that. And there's this anticipation around that. Why not apply that to food? The seasonality and the excitement around getting to have it is that the hype and the excitement, then you get to have it and it really does taste that much better. And then if it's grown in a super mindful, regenerative, organic way, that inherently will taste better too. And you'll always remember it and you'll appreciate it more. And I think that the relationship to food, I think that's where Ecology Center, I think you guys have elevated that experience for a consumer. It's to look at food from a different perspective and see the process and then taste that process And then it's kind of, your body almost craves it at that point. It doesn't really want to go back. And I think part of it's rooted in education, but the other is rooted in experience. So how much is it about, encouraging people to even just try a week not going to the grocery store and finding food elsewhere? Where do you find like the most, I guess, like tipping point for somebody to actually kind of get it?
Yeah. So I'll start by saying that behavior change is tremendously challenging. It's like one of the hardest things to do on this planet is get people to change their practices. We're very good at locking into the same thing all day, every day, expectations, needs, whatever it might be. But for us, it's not that hard once we can get people to the farm, because we can share a meal. We break bread and we have you try something that is more delicious and interesting and seasonal and healthy. And it's pretty easy to say like, oh, wow, if I ate like this every day, I think I would feel better. I like to think about like, what are the motivating factors for people? And most of the time in that pyramid, it's kind of selfishness, which is like, all right, how is this going to affect me the most? So that's a conversation that I'm very comfortable having. I'm certain you've heard of the Blue Zones book and the philosophy, right? The few places in the world in which the people live the longest and what those places share in common. And they're like as far away from one another as you can imagine. There's one here in Southern California called Loma Linda. There you have Japan, you've got Greece. But like, what do these places have in common? One, it's how they eat. And two, it's the community that they share. So if we can help one another, and I find it to be interesting that the one here in Southern California is in this kind of tiny little community, which happens to be predominantly Seventh-day Adventist. And why are those people living longer? It's because they don't eat meat and they predominantly don't eat sugar or caffeine. And then what kind of community are they building? It's a religious community, right? And that's one form of community building. Whereas in Japan, it's more of a traditional and intergenerational practice of helping our elder communities and supporting one another. So whatever the motivating factor is, like we get to do both of those things at the Ecology Center every day, which is that we eat healthy food, we're outside, we're moving around, we're working with our hands, and then we're building community, right? Through educational experiences or dinners or whatever it might be. And if you just like, the nice thing is when people sit into an experience at the Ecology Center or anywhere else that does this work, they don't always know or understand why they feel so good, but they do. So like, we don't need to be in your face and like cite the academic study. The work kind of speaks for itself when you come around and you're like, oh, this is great. I just love it here, and I don't really know why. And that's kind of winning at the end of the day.
What's your favorite thing that the Ecology Center actually does? Because you guys do a whole host of things. For you, what's your favorite thing that the Ecology Center does?
I hate to be cheesy with it, but for me, it's this kind of the holistic interpretation of it all in one. There's a permacultural principle called stacking functions. We do and demonstrate that every day. So, we have a school on site and we have a farm, and you might think like, and we're building a restaurant. So you might think like, of the three industries in which I could possibly imagine are the hardest to run successfully, like schools, farms, and restaurants are it. And we're a nonprofit on top of it, which inherently is pretty challenging. But, doing those things in concert to one another add value to themselves individually and collectively. So it's hard to break apart pieces and say, wow, I really love this program, or I really love that initiative or this piece of it. But it really is, they're all one, so our farm is our school and our restaurant is our farm. And our farm is our restaurant. So, that sort of stuff I think is all very cool. And then I get jazzed up around some of the impact initiatives because we're a nonprofit, are able to mobilize philanthropy to fill some of those gaps. So like in our farm stand, we've got this, world-class little expression of local regenerative organic agriculture in our community. And it's the best place that you can go and buy produce and in our geography. And I say that with humility. It just simply is. But it is a premium offering. And that's a hard thing, right? When you're talking about inclusivity and accessibility. So one of the things that we were able to do through philanthropy is, one, we got EBT accepted. So the process of, in California, it's CalFresh. It used to be called food stamps. So we introduced the EBT platform and system. And then 2, we match all EBT purchases 1-to-1. So if you come into the farm stand, you might be a food insecure family or individual, and you spend $100, now you get $200 worth. And that's just like a small thing that we can do to fight against the cost, the quality, and the convenience of making alternative decisions, because it's still very hard for a family to say no to, a $10 meal for 3 at Carl's Jr., because your kids are going to eat it. It's going to be easy and it's going to be fast. So even subsidized food is a hard thing to sell, but we're seeing that gain traction. We have over 200 families a week coming in and using this EBT match program. So like stuff like that, I get really inspired and jazzed up about.
Yeah, that's incredible. And what's the favorite thing that you've had at the farm?
I mean, I know
you mentioned the cucumbers for sure, but
my favorite thing that we grow at the farm are these beautiful striped green zebra tomatoes. Some people think that they're frying tomatoes because that's what we associate green tomatoes with, but they're not. They're slicers, and they're beautiful and delicious and always come at the right time.
Wow, that's incredible. And so what do you think is going to be the next steps for Ecology Center? And like, is it the restaurant? Is it more engagement with the community? Is it, time for summer hosted dinners? I mean, what's kind of the flow of things over there?
Yeah, well, we have no lack of ambition. So we have all that stuff already. We do a dinner every Friday night. We are opening a restaurant on June 21st. We do stuff like a music festival. We do movie screenings. We've got the summer camp. There's so much on this small piece of land that just mobilizes tens of thousands of people a year. And that's cool. And it's fun. And it's kind of really becoming its own ecosystem that has a gravitational pull for our geography. We happen to be in Orange County. We're 50 miles in either direction to over 15 million people between San Diego, Orange, and Los Angeles counties. We've gotten a great deal of traction and a lot of enthusiasm and support and participation. And there's near infinite more, where we're with, again, humility at this point where we're becoming a destination for people to travel to. And we're fortunate to be right by a train station. And, many people are, like I said, pretty close and can access it for a day trip or for an experience or to just even come and walk around. So that's cool. And it's fun. And it's great to see every day the amount of people that are just really appreciating and enjoying the fact that we exist. That's, the simple beauty and joy that comes to us as organizational leaders by just seeing grandparents bring their grandkids and walking around the farm and showing them what they used to grow. It's amazing. And that's a real meaningful experience. The growth for us in talking earlier about scale and, again, humility and even like lifestyle and values and needs, like it's not about infinite and rapid expansion. I don't necessarily dream about a time when there's an ecology center in every major city in the United States. Like that's not what's driving us to show up for our community. And I do think that once you start to shift to that mindset and mentality, it's when you start to lose some of the integrity and authenticity and expression. I don't know what's best for Jacksonville, Florida. I don't know what's best for Columbus, Ohio. Those are not communities that I'm from. I'm from Southern California. But that being said, we do now have this unique opportunity to serve as kind of a model and mentorship for maybe other entrepreneurs or nonprofits or for-profits and bigger businesses that do want to adopt and implement some of these practices. So I am excited about the work that we get to do in the replication space. About 5 years ago, a school district in San Diego came to us and said, hey, we've got this 10-acre lot. We want to create a school farm. Can you help us? And we designed and built and staffed and programmed and trained and educated and built really what's the first certified organic school farm in the country in Encinitas at the Encinitas Union School District. And we grow food for their students and have educational experiences. And then we're able to hand that project off back to them, essentially saying, this doesn't need to be the Ecology Center. You guys, we taught you how to fly. Now you fly yourselves. And then that was a significant investment of our time and resources and energy. And then we learned through that process how to create a more efficient methodology of replication. And then, 2.5 years ago, Anaheim Union High School District came to us and said the same thing. We've got this dirt lot that's been next to our school for 50 years. The kids have gone to use to smash bottles and smoke pot. Can you help turn it into something special and meaningful like the Ecology Center? So we did that there, and we designed and built and trained and helped program and mentor, and then handed it right back off to them. It didn't need to take 4 years. It took a year and a half, and now they're up and running and flying. And I see those opportunities as near infinite. I think of 3 partners to me that are very exciting to target, which is schools, housing developers, and cities. All 3 of these institutions have decent amounts of land available and also resources, and could, if they choose to, prioritize bringing agriculture back into their culture.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And I think what's so cool about that process is there's a sense of ownership around it for the community too. Like they didn't just, for lack of a better term, just purchase it, saying, hey, we'll buy into the franchise of the Ecology Center and just put it on here. It actually is like a instance of, well, we built this in collaboration and community with the Ecology Center. And I think that part is really exciting. Did you ever think that, obviously hindsight's 2020, but did you ever think that you'd be in this position in life for yourself?
Not in the least. No, not at all. I mean, in that I had a dream of being in the impact space, and I've always been very entrepreneurial. My dad was an entrepreneur. I started multiple small things, for-profit and nonprofit, throughout both as a college student and as a recent grad. So, coming into this place of having this thing that people enjoy and appreciate, maybe being a natural organizer, it's something I've always done, right? From hosting small grassroots initiatives to now something a little bit bigger, sure. But no, I mean, it's to be completely honest, it's all privilege and opportunity. I like to think of how, and not to, I guess, to plug another podcast here, but I listen to How I Built This, and I'm sure a lot of people do. And I sometimes I just want to hear it for the last 20 seconds when Guy Raz asks, are you where you are because of luck or hard work? And just about everyone says hard work. And I've worked really hard, to be fair to myself and to my partner who helps keep this house and alive and up. But the truth is, like, I am where I am because a white presenting person in Southern California who grew up in the middle class that had the opportunity to focus my energy and attention not on survival, but on thriving and on community. So I don't know if that's the narrative for the GOAT podcast, but I do like to have us all take a little bit of stock of our personal privilege and say and acknowledge the fact that life is a lot harder for other people, and fortunately has been a little bit easier for me.
Yeah, 100%. And in all of nature, where's your favorite place to enjoy it?
Oh gosh, it's a great question. My wife and I camp a good amount and like to get out as much as possible. So I have my farm, and we're fortunate to have this beautiful, expressive farm that is really unlike most that you'll ever see. We have the luxury and the opportunity and the space to focus on art and creativity and expression in a pretty magical way at the Ecology Center. So that's my daily outdoor space. I think about one of our mentors in this movement talks about how we spend our life in boxes. We've got our car box, our house box, and our office box. And how, in this new, it's not new, it's actually very old, but now renewed enthusiasm for the health effects of being outdoors, we're starting to see these like Western medical practices quantifying the benefits of like Japanese forest bathing. So like I get to do that every day, and that's cool. And then I've got like my special outdoor experiences. And for me, it's usually in and around the mountains or water. We like to go up to the Mammoth Lakes, which is in the Eastern Sierras, every year, and you just enjoy time in the water up there and in the trees.
Yeah. I think there's something special about that. I mean, I just moved back to the water because there's something about water that it's very healing and just relaxing to be around, whether it's a lake, whether it's a stream, whether it's ocean. There's something with water, trees, mountains. Like when you start to put all those things together, there's something unexplainable about it that is very, very nice, I think. So, Jonathan, thanks so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. Like, I think from a food perspective, it's something that I've been very careful to explore because the story needs to be told right. And I think the way that you've explained the story and the way that the Ecology Center tells the food story, I think is a perfect example of what the future of food should look like and can look like. And I think it's more on the responsibility of us as consumers and our decisions and what we decide to consume, what we decide to buy, where we decide to do that, and the questions that we ask of the world around us. I think that's going to influence a lot of it. So I just want to thank you for taking the time to be a part of this, because I think you are the perfect spokesman for the idea of really high quality, healing, nourishing food, both for people and the planet.
Well, I think you, Steve, and we're just kind of continuing this long legacy, right? Like, it's not about the Ecology Center, and we're certainly not the experts or the originators of any of these thoughts or beliefs. I think, a few simple names I can throw out for anyone that's interested in furthering their education in this space, like read Vandana Shiva or Michael Pollan or Paul Stamets, or, dozens and dozens of other people who for 50 years have been carrying this torch of, I like to call it how stuff used to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Well, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, bud. All right. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you for listening to the Sustainable Goat podcast. I'm your host, Steve Castanham. With each episode, we can further define what it means to create a truly sustainable and resilient future.
I think the new status is to show that you actually care. You want to drive change and you want to be part of a sustainable future.
People fight for what they love.
Let's really all target for a small but significant shift in the way we live, we consume, and we plan our life.
Join us at sustainablegoat.com.